So Deadleg's court report column on Wednesday focused on various conferences' forfeit policies. You talked to a whole bunch of conference commissioners, I think nearly a dozen. What did you, I mean, I know what you learned. I read the story, but this is how we do it on the podcast. What did you learn while you were reporting the court report?
All right, so not if you could do a solid and link this in the episode description for if people are going to listen to this and they want to read it. It is a little long, but this is what the Omicron variant's doing to us. So yeah, I talked to about a dozen commissioners, almost everyone in the power conference structure. I couldn't get Kevin Warren of the Big Ten because the Big Ten doesn't play games in league play again until January 2nd. So there's not the same amount of urgency to update its forfeit policy the way that other leagues have at the moment. But you know, I think the big story on Wednesday in college sports, well, it was one, Texas A&M now can't play in the Gator Bowl because it's had an outbreak. So the issue college basketball has inevitably jumped to college football. And then the other thing was just everything tied to the Omicron variant and how college basketball's had, I mean, as we speak right now, I think we're 56, 57 teams that have had to go on pause. In reality, it's probably a couple more. There might be a couple of teams that are technically on pause right now. They just haven't announced it because they're not playing a game. There's no reason to do it. So the number continues to rise. And so with all this, we talked about this a little on the Tuesday episode, but the need for forfeits to no longer be league policy has been activated. You had the ACC reverse its rule. You had the Big 12 and the Big West technically were the first ones to do it. They voted on that Tuesday. And then the ACC, the Pac-12, the Mountain West did it. There have been some other leagues. The Big South has done it. There's been a lot of leagues, but not every league, which was interesting to learn. The American Athletic Conference, the Atlantic 10, the Missouri Valley, and the WAC all have discussed and passed for now revoking their forfeit policies. And I spoke with Missouri Valley Commissioner Jeff Jackson, and I spoke with WAC Commissioner Brian Thornton and A10 Commissioner Bernadette McGlade about all of this. And some of it is the past like 5 days have been so insanely noisy and topsy-turvy. Let's just make absolutely sure, because the other side of this is that, and Jeff Jackson told me more about this. He said, listen, if you want to get rid of it, that's fine. But if you get rid of the forfeit policy, the absolute most crucial detail to this season that was not true last season, conference scheduling was specifically built with having rescheduled games in mind. You knew it was going to happen. You had back-to-backs. You had travel partners in some leagues. So there were mechanisms in place to help replace a lot of games. And that's why actually last season, a lot of power conferences and a lot of leagues, even though we lost games, a lot of them were made up because the schedule allowed for it. That is not the case this season. The schedule was built as though we weren't still in the dumbest pandemic of our lifetimes, that we wouldn't be losing games. Reminder, your boy right here, humongous idiot. I mean, all-time bad call, under 0.5 forfeits this season. Horrendous. Okay. But this is
really bad. That's really bad.
I mean, but I'm not going to play that audio again. I brought you down with me on that, if you recall. So anyway, Jeff Jackson was saying you are going to have effects with all these teams. Let's say team A can't play. Okay. And you're going to say, okay, now it's a no contest. We'll try and reschedule. Team B can play. And then you're going to try and reschedule. Then it could affect Team C and Team D and then Team E, because you're going to try and put all these pieces together when you don't have the schedule to do it. So what actually might wind up happening is you lose even more conference games because of this, and your standings are just as much of a mess. Having the forfeit rule in place isn't perfect, but it also takes the gamesmanship element off the table. And by that, I mean, as Parrish no doubt has heard from coaches as well, there is no shortage. It's not an overriding sentiment, but there's no shortage of cynicism over teams not playing games and coaches having no way of proving that that the other team legitimately can't field a team. I had a coach tell me last night, he said, I quoted him because I'm not going to show you the coach, but this is the quote. He said, first of all, we got bleeped out on 4 or 5 games last year, and now I know that's going to happen again. This is a coach in a league that's forfeit rule got reversed. He said, I'm telling you right now, teams will duck games. I don't think we need to go backward here. Are we always going to cancel games going forward? Are we just going to keep pulling kids out? When is this going to stop? Will it change next year? Do we have any promises that it won't? His point is this. You can have situations where there might be teams, depending on where they are in the standings and how the schedule lines up, say, you know what, like, we don't have 3 starters, so let's just say it's just health and safety, school protocols. Because what's happening is the team that doesn't wind up playing, they don't have to be completely transparent with the other team about who's not playing and why. Jeff Jackson did say there is, and you have to attest. Each team doctor has to attest that that's the case. Like in theory, the team doctor is removed from the coach and all that stuff. But it was a good point. You take the gamesmanship off the table. The forfeit is still there. You know the schedule no matter what. And so I'll just tag it with this. It's a long story. We haven't even got to the other elements. But he said, it's not like we're not going to readdress this in 2 weeks if we don't need to. But this idea that you don't have a case against keeping the forfeit on the table is not entirely true, particularly because we believe we'll get a number of teams that will get fully boosted. And hopefully this issue won't be as prominent in 3 weeks as it is now. It was interesting, kind of both sides of the case there. I would take forfeits off, but I understand why some leagues aren't yet.
My perspective after talking, not so much yesterday, but over the past 8-9 months, through last season and throughout the off season, was that you're right. There is a perception among coaches that people were gaming the system to get out of games. When you talk to people who work in conference offices, they're less sure of that. Like, what conference administrators will tell you is that coaches are paranoid and they always believe somebody's trying to get over on them. It probably happens somewhere, sometime, but not nearly as often as the coaches think that it happened. Who's right, who's wrong, I don't know. But I from my conversations, coaches' perception of how much people were trying to get over doesn't line up with conference administrators' perception of how often teams were trying to get over and get out of games for whatever reason. Listen, I understand it's complicated and reasonable people can disagree on this. I would just forever argue. I'm trying to avoid worst case scenario. And the worst case scenario for me is making a team that's 100% vaccinated forfeit a game because they had breakthrough cases that were unavoidable because we're dealing with a variant that is more contagious than anything we've ever seen. I think that's the worst thing that can happen here. So let's do what we can do to avoid that. And, let's perhaps there's no perfect way to make sure everybody is being transparent and honest. But, I mean, Jesus, at some point we got to trust somebody. And can we trust the doctors who are making these decisions? Like if the doctor says you can play, then go play. And if the doctor says you can't play, then don't go play. And yes, I'm sure somewhere, somebody will get over on somebody else. Like, okay, fine. I'd rather have that happen somewhere, sometime, than watch fully vaccinated teams have to forfeit games. And by extension, perhaps cost themselves a chance at a conference championship because of breakthrough cases that they could not avoid. I don't feel sorry for unvaccinated teams that have to shut down and forfeit. If you told me there was a way to make the unvaccinated teams forfeit and let the fully vaccinated teams not, I would say, yes, that's what I'm for. If you can't get your team fully vaccinated or close to it and you have to shut down, then that's on you. That's a failure in leadership. But if you're fully vaccinated and you still got to shut down because of breakthrough cases, because we're just living in an unprecedented time, I don't feel like a forfeit should be the byproduct of that.
Yeah. But as we record this Thursday morning, I would expect a couple more conferences to announce that they're going to walk back their forfeit rule. I will also add the Pac-12 has a wrinkle, though. The Pac-12 still has a forfeit on the table. Again, this is where it gets a little bit tricky, but the Pac-12 is leaving open the possibility for forfeits if, in the judgment of the league office, the spirit of sportsmanship, I think is how they're calling it. Basically, like, if the league has reason to believe that a team has not played a game when it otherwise could have, then they can still assess a forfeit to a team. So that threat still looms in the Pac-12. But these other forfeits are now off the table. Like Washington had to take a forfeit loss because it couldn't reschedule against UCLA. That's now UCLA doesn't have that league win. Washington doesn't have that league loss. There were reports on Wednesday that the Big East rescinded it. That seems inevitable. I checked in with one source. who was like, it's going to happen. It's just maybe not technically there yet. But I think the Big East is going to announce that on Thursday. Whatever. Those are going to, the Seton Hall ones, the DePaul ones, those will be off the books. The ACC, Wake Forest had a win. BC had a loss. Those are off the books. And again, it's important to know going forward, you're going to hear postponed, I think. You're not going to hear canceled because you're going to have an attempt to reschedule the game. Now, we'll see if these conferences get into a situation 4 days from now, 8 days from now, 14 days from now, where you lose 4 or 5 games in a 24-hour span. It's like, where are we putting these things? Again, the TV inventory, they don't have a lot of flexibility. The Pac-12 is different because the Pac-12 has travel partners and Thursday, Saturday games. So the Pac-12 actually has this Monday, Tuesday window where it can fill in games. It's in a better spot than, say, the ACC or the Big East or the Big 12, which will have a game on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Saturday kind of deal. It just doesn't have quite as much there. So expect a January that's going to have plenty of postponements that turn into cancellations, irregular conference standings. And I will be interested to see if we have those leagues that have the forfeit rule still on the books. And if we have more that still have forfeit rules that ultimately decide not to change it. It's not like we got one, we got 4 of them. How those look at the end of the season, because in speaking with those commissioners of those leagues that are sticking with this for now, they all agree that like what we don't want to have happen, and we will, essentially take action if it does, is we don't want to have a situation where a team suddenly has like 5 or 6 of its league wins have come by forfeit. The forfeit rule was put in place with the best of intentions, and the intentions were no one knew there was going to be an Omicron variant, and it was a way to encourage vaccination, spread good word on public health, and tell teams, listen, if everyone else is vaccinated and, you are protected against positive cases, that was the idea, right? And now Omicron's just changed the dynamic of everything. And so that's the forfeit side of it. You got a thought, or can I get to the other half of the course?
Well, I would just put in like the policy that's been floating around, because like I wouldn't want to leave it up to we think we can play, we think we can't play. Like, well, we're not going to play. I don't want that. I think the one that I've seen floated and I believe implemented with some conferences is if you got 7, you have a roster.
That's also going to be across the board, right? Yes.
Right. You have a roster. Now, in walk-ons are a part of your team, so they count. If you don't want them to be a part of your team, kick them off your team. But as long as they're on your roster, they're part of your team. You got 7 healthy players and 1 healthy coach, you can play the game. I would draw that line as strict as that. And because what I wouldn't want to ever get into is, all right, we're missing our 7th leading scorer and 9th leading scorer. We could play. We're losing our top 2 scorers. We can't play.
No. I'm telling you, man, that cynicism exists.
And that's why I draw the line. If you got 7, if your doctor, and again, at some point on this stuff, we just got to trust somebody, right?
I know.
And if your doctor, if all the paperwork's in and all the tests are back, and you've got 7 healthy players and 1 coach, you're going to go play the game. And if you have to play it without your top 2 scorers, that's too bad, but we're doing the best we can.
Yeah, it's called the 7-1 rule. Although the Big 12 has 6-1. All you need is 6. ACC, Pac-12. I believe the Pac-12, I don't have it in front of me. I think the Pac-12, you have to have 7 scholarship players. The ACC, it's 7 players, period. Like, if you've got 4 scholarships and 3 walk-ons, you got 7, you're playing. Which, again...
I would make it 7 humans who are on your roster. I don't care. I don't care if they're on scholarship or not.
I'm not happy about this idea that we have 2 scholarships of those 7, but whatever. And then the A10 has the highest threshold. The A10 is actually 8-1. So there's that. Okay. The other element to this, and again, we'll link this story in today's podcast description, is January is going to be rickety, no doubt about it. We're not going to avoid that. Fortunately, it seems like a lot of teams that have players eligible to get boosted now, they're after 6 months, they're trying to get it done now so that, by the time we get the first or second week of January, breakthrough cases are just less likely. But there becomes this issue where, and this is going to actually potentially affect the college football playoff, which is super interesting and highly unfortunate, of course. What do you do about the testing situation with all these teams? Because there's not uniform testing. So Mike Krzyzewski said over the weekend, Duke is back to daily testing, and he wants it to be a case like last season when there weren't vaccines available to everyone, where teams test the day before, the night before, and then team doctors share information, then they know going in the next day, you're good to go. That is not happening everywhere. And it hasn't been happening, as I mentioned, I think on a previous podcast. Like a lot of teams were not testing at all for 2 months because they had a fully vaccinated roster. No one was presenting symptoms. There have been other teams. I did talk to a couple of coaches where they say, nah, the way it works here, man, is like I had one coach tell me he had everyone except one player vaccinated, but the university policy is they have tested once a week, every week since school started. So it's different everywhere, right? The question becomes, and the NFL and the NBA are dealing with all of this, is pretty much everyone agrees that if you show symptoms and you test positive, regardless of your status of vaccination, you need to sit, obviously. If you are a member of a team and that happens and you're unvaccinated, you immediately go into contact tracing, obviously. But if you are asymptomatic and you are 2 shots, and particularly if you are boosted, as Adam Silver talked about with the NBA, because the great thing about the NBA is it's got all this money to use on testing. It's monitoring its population of thousands of people between players and employees. It's got like real functional data that is supremely helpful on this. Adam Silver said earlier on ESPN this week, listen, 90% of our cases are Omicron. It's ridiculous how quickly Omicron has taken over the country. We didn't know this was a thing 5 weeks ago. And in a week's time, it went from like 5% of cases in the country to 73%. It's absurd how transmissible Omicron is. But the relative good news is on an individual basis, it doesn't look like it would be as damaging as Delta, right? But because it spread so quickly from a societal standpoint, it's actually just as damaging. That's why our hospitals overrun, and we need to keep that in mind. But what Adam Silver said was, we are seeing very few instances where boosted people have had a breakthrough case or even have symptoms. So what these schools are going to have to decide, because this isn't an NCAA rule until we get to postseason play. Again, it's all schools and conferences and local decisions. Will you choose to test asymptomatic, vaccinated, or boosted players? Because some schools say 1 positive test in your program, everyone gets tested. Some schools are 1 positive test, we contact trace. Some might, some not. In other programs, like, for example, with Georgia Tech, although it wound up going on pause, Georgia Tech had a couple players test positive. The boosted players on the roster and fully vaccinated did not have to test because they weren't symptomatic. Subsequent tests put them in. But if you're going to have that situation, you are less likely to lose games. The NCAA is following CDC guidelines. We also have to talk about quarantines and isolations. It's a very knotty, thorny, complex issue here. But the bottom line is, the more that teams test asymptomatic, vaccinated, and boosted players, because Omicron is good at puncturing particularly 2-shot vax players, you're just more likely to have more positive tests. Players sit, lose more games, and it could really just, it could desecrate the schedule in January. And if that's what happens, that's what happens. But college basketball and the NCAA need to figure out what they're going to do here. One last thing, I know I'm kind of going long on this, but again, these are the conversations that everyone is having around college sports, and they're going to matter as it pertains to what we talk about on this podcast and college sports, college football. The last thing is this. NCAA had a call on Wednesday with its chief medical officer and medical advisory, and then a representative, at least one from every single conference. NCAA has always followed CDC guidelines. And right now, the CDC guidelines is if you're boosted or fully vaccinated and you test positive for COVID, you go into isolation for 10 days. There is an expectation that the CDC is going to reduce that number to 5 or 7 at some point in the next 2 or 3 weeks, hopefully. But there's no guarantee it'll happen. But the NBA is showing and suggesting data that you don't need to be 10 days. It can be 5 or 7, and that you can test out of quarantine. The NFL has changed its rules. And so the big curiosity right now in college sports is this. You got the college football playoff coming up in 9 days here? Georgia's got COVID issues. Christmas is right here. What if you have one of these teams, Alabama, Michigan, Cincinnati, Georgia, where they've got significant players that are fully vaxxed, maybe even boosted, test positive, right? Would a conference relying on its own medical group choose to follow the science from the NBA or the NFL and not wait on the CDC change and go out of step with the NCAA to create its own protocol? So theoretically, a team could get its player out of quarantine in 5 or 7 days instead of having to wait 10. And that difference in days is the difference between those players playing in a football game or not. And how will that impact college basketball going forward? Very interesting to keep an eye on, because there's going to be more coming in the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, it was interesting. The college football playoff announced yesterday that the semifinals will be played on New Year's Eve. And if somebody can't play, they just forfeit. And if both teams can't play, then the other semifinal is the national championship game. And if 3 of the 4 teams can't play, then the healthy team, the lone healthy team, is your national champion.
Please do not let us get there, man. That would just be horrendous. Terrible. But yes, anyway, keep going.
Yeah. I will say from the you mentioned how coaches are how cynicism is very much a thing among coaches, that everybody's doing this. What I hear from coaches is that, they all tell you we're doing it the right way, but let me tell you who's not doing it the right way. Mm-hmm. And they don't always use names. But here's one story I heard was that coach told me that he heard, and so take this for whatever it's worth. But coaches are now realizing, I think most coaches were optimistic, like we were, that if we get our teams vaccinated, we're going to be fine. And now we're finding out you're not. You're just not fine, or you're at least potentially not fine. And one coach told me he heard that, the way you're supposed to do it is if a player has symptoms or isn't feeling well, you need to tell somebody immediately, and then you need to test immediately. I had a coach tell me he heard a coach was instead telling that player to go home. Just go home, skip practice today, and let's hope that you feel better tomorrow. And if you don't feel better tomorrow, let's hope you feel better the next day. In other words, don't test them. Just get them out of there, but don't test them, because if the test comes back positive, it would trigger more tests, and then that could trigger a shutdown.
Yeah, and that, by the way, that is a suspensionable offense at the very least from the coach, just to state the obvious there. I wouldn't be shocked to learn that that's happening. Can't be operating like that in a pandemic, though. Not when our hospitals are overrun, and you got to know, if you think you are sick, you have to know if you've been infected. But I know the purpose you're saying for the story. I'm not endorsing this whatsoever. That's absolutely crappy behavior, and it wouldn't shock me to learn that there are coaches that are actually doing that.
What a mess, man. Is this the dumbest pandemic or not? People kept questioning me over the past, 2 years, saying this was the dumbest pandemic of my lifetime. Are there anybody disagreeing with me now?
You were on this early.
I was on this early.
You were on this very early. We'll wrap up the COVID stuff, but I'll just share a quick quote from Bob Bowlesby, Big 12 commissioner. He said, anybody that thinks we're going to be able to put a policy in place and it's guaranteed to help us manage basketball throughout the season without issues is delusional. Bob Bowlesby also told me he wasn't buying into the drama. Bowlesby, great interview. He was insightful. In fact, he also said, because I followed up with him on it after he told me this, he said he thought the NBA and NFL data were going to lead for college sports in the next couple of weeks there. Again, the question is purely hypothetical. It's determined behind the scenes that Alabama will have seven of its 22 starters that can't play in the semifinal. Would the SEC, with its own medical group, be in contact with the NFL, with the NBA, and say, the data here for boosted players suggests that isolation can be cleared after 5 days, granted that the tests are negative instead of 10? And if they think, I'd just be interested to see if we get there. Or if we're in the middle of January, there's no CDC update to guidelines. The NCAA is not going to change until the CDC does. We know that's the case. Would any conference change? I don't know. We'll wait and see on that right now. But yes, it's going to be plenty noisy. Again, there's more in the story in the corporate report. You can go read it. And there we are. You want to talk a little more hoops before we get to the Christmas goodies?
Yeah, and I would make this note because I get some pushback on this on radio sometimes too. It's a lot of COVID talk and protocols and testing and Omicron. And the truth is, this is the dominant story in sports. It just is. It's the dominant story in college football right now. It's the dominant story in college basketball right now. It's the dominant story in the NBA, in the NFL. There's no intelligent way to avoid this. I mean, I guess you could just say we're not going to talk about it and do it. But if that's what you want, I'm sure there's a podcast out there for you. I'm sure somebody's doing that. I'm more interested. And this is the reason why we decided years ago that it would just be me and Deadleg talking every day or, 3 times a week. No guest, no third person, so that we could pick out the biggest topics in the sport that we think are interesting, and then discuss them. It's sometimes in a goofy way, sometimes in a serious way. And it seems to have worked. And so that's what we continue to do. And there's just no getting around the impact that COVID, specifically the Omicron variant, is having on the sport right now. You know, he and I both talk to people every day in this sport, and the conversations every time either start with this or end with this. They get there at some point. This is the truth. Is we probably should have led on it today, but I just didn't want to because I wanted to leave us.
I'm glad we didn't. Yeah, I'm glad we did.